Welcome back, everyone, to part 2 of AJ Sims discussing all sorts of lifestyle stuff in bodybuilding. So today we were going to kind of dive into more specific, like show prep, peaking stuff, right?
Yeah, man, I think this is what people have been waiting for. They want to get into kind of a deep dive of what goes on in a prep. People always have questions on water and sodium and carbs and how to approach it. So I think it's good that we just get some great information out, educate people in a healthy, safe manner, because it can be done to do it right and understand how the body works from a physiological standpoint. Now, we know, Kurt, that bodybuilding on paper doesn't always make sense, right? So there's some crazy things that can happen. There's different body types, metabolisms, responses to certain things. But at the same time, we know that there's a lot of data out there with things that people are doing. So I would love to put that out there with you. And again, your medical background, we can really do a deep dive and get into this, man.
Yep. And I think with that too, so there's not always data or studies to support some of this stuff, right? Because you're taking athletes, not ill people or elderly people, and you're adding also other chemicals to the situation. And even if it were one chemical, there might be a study on some of these things, but generally, polypharmacy, there's not a ton of stuff out there. No one studies this stuff. So you and I have to go on a limb sometimes based on experience, right? You can only take the science so far, and then you kind of...
I tell people that all the time. They've never done long-term clinical studies on a bodybuilder that's 250 pounds at 3% body fat. They're never going to do it. So this has to be antidote along with knowing knowledge behind the pharmaceuticals and nutrition and how to dial a body in and how to manage cortisol and fatigue and mineral corticoids, if I'm saying that correctly. All these things in the body that goes into the final week to produce the best look possible. And I want to start it with this, and you can agree or disagree, Kurt. I think you're going to agree. The most important thing is get all the body fat off.
Yeah. So we both seen lots of guys that think they're ready, right? And they're weeks out still. It's generally, for a lot, especially in the amateur level, it's generally not a water issue. It's a body fat issue. Yeah, right? Guys just don't get, or girls. We're specifically talking about men in this case, but a lot of times they just don't get lean enough. It takes a lot of suffering and a lot of willpower to get that lean, right? And what you see on Instagram, what people post is generally that's like Instagram lean, but it's not show lean. Like when you see these guys post, it's a very different thing. You and I stay both very lean, but like we're still not show lean. You can't say show lean all the time. It's not possible.
No, not at all. And I mean, I'll touch on that. I mean, I've always told people, and this is kind of a rule that I used to live by, when you think you look good in the mirror, typically to be stage ready, it has to be almost tenfold.
Yeah. Yep.
That's really at the end of the day. And really, when you know you're really, really in good shape is when you take pictures in really bad lighting and you still look good.
Yeah.
Because no matter the lighting, when the body fat's gone and the elasticity of the skin is just tight against the muscle, you know that everything's there needed, and it's just a matter of manipulating and shifting fluids properly from the sub-Q layer and intracellularly. And we talked about that off camera, and we'll get into how we do that and kind of the total opposite of what the bodybuilding community has been taught, and it will definitely be going against the grain. So anything you want to lead off with, man? I don't know where you want to start. If you want to start at the beginning of a prep, mid prep, or just into the final week, man.
Yeah, we can. I mean, we can start at the beginning. I mean, and go that's pretty straightforward, right? I mean, to typically start guys, at the amateur level, 20 weeks, 26 weeks gives enough time for some mistakes, possibly a diet break, depending on how severe things go.
Absolutely.
Assuming that they're in some sort of shape to even start a prep. I meet guys sometimes that they're just literally not. They just need to casually train for a while before they're even ready to do this. And usually you're just getting their diet cleaned up, right? You're trying to figure out what maintenance is. Yeah. Like we both, you and I both utilize carb cycling. So I try to establish some sort of baseline in there on a medium day, right? That's going to be the average training day. And then I have, 1 or 2 deficit days and possibly 1 or 2 high days, depending on their physique. And we kind of just establish what the baseline. I generally start with the minimum effective dosage of everything: cardio, training, gear, food. That way you have a lot of runway to manipulate things. I know a lot of guys will start with 6 or 7 days of cardio and all this stuff right out the gate. To me, that seems a little crazy, because you're gonna hit a plateau. There's always that wall. And where do you go? Like, I don't know how you what do you do when you start a prep with a guy?
Man,
if I can feel we're prepping.
Yeah, it's varied over the years. It can vary client to client. Typically do go that route, but I will also go the route sometimes of going hard out the gate. Now, when I say that, that doesn't mean cardio 6 times a week. That absolutely not. What that means is more nutritional. I will attack the deficit a little harder. The reason why is because if somebody has been just blasting food for a long period of time, they're not really hungry. So they're actually going to appreciate the deficit right out the gate, and they have the energy and the willpower to actually do that. But again, we don't want to go hard out the gate in terms of adding, fat burners in, and then 6 days a week cardio and a hard deficit. Then we have nothing to play with, right? So I will attack it nutritionally hard right off the bat with some people. And then we go from maybe just going from an activity of level of say 8 to 10,000 steps, maybe up to 12,000 steps and a couple days of, low intensity steady state. Or if the athlete is a different type of athlete, we might do a couple of days of glycolytic cardio, some more HIIT cardio, where I like circuit style cardio just to keep it interesting, battle ropes, assault bike. This actually saves the legs as well and will help keep fullness. Maybe not an Olympia guy, because I don't think you're going to see any 270-pound guy doing battle ropes probably. But
so I think John Jewett does.
John Jewett might be the only one, but he's a thinking man's bodybuilder. So he actually understands the reason behind that, right?
Yeah.
More of a glycolytic cardio. So we can cycle just neat, non-exercise activity thermogenesis, low intensity steady state, and HIIT cardio. You can play around with that. Really cool that you touched on it. Right out the gate, you talked about a diet break, and this is so vital and important because we've heard, about refeeds, and I talk about super saturation days and cheat meals people talk about. But we know that the data shows that without something longer term, typically 48 hours is the minimum, you really don't get a metabolic response in terms of a T4 to T3 and leptin conversion of more fat burning hormone increase. Or as you dive deeper, my friend, you know how important reverse T3 is. And we know if someone gets more into a deficit, we've talked about this, and you actually helped educate me more on reverse T3 and understanding that the higher it is, the more bound up that free T3 is, right? So we're not getting any type of response hormonally in a fat burning sense unless we're doing something in a longer period. So like you said, a diet break, increasing a caloric intake over the period of either 48 hours to maybe even a whole week or sometimes 2 weeks. And if you're starting someone 20, 25 weeks out, you have that time frame. That's why I always tell guys, listen, don't try to start a prep 12, 16 weeks out. It just doesn't make sense. You're not taking time to peel back the layers of the onion, for lack of better terms.
Yeah, no, I agree. I think unless you're very, very lean to begin with, it makes sense.
Yes.
To take longer. And you can do it, slower. I do agree with some guys though, attack while they have energy, be aggressive, and then bring the food up at the end. I've done that as well. Just like on average, generally I'll start guys that have never competed. Like if you have an amateur who's never competed, you want to kind of ease them into stuff. I think with thyroid, because we could touch on that really fast. Obviously thyroid drugs are used at some level. I generally would use it as a last resort because there are long-term repercussions that can occur. We see, guys can mess up their thyroid pretty easily if it's misused. I think it can help at the end though, when things start to slow down. Like we were talking about, when you look at the labs, you generally see if someone gets sick or if they've been dieting for too long, the T3, which is really the active thyroid hormone, basically starts to go the other direction because the metabolism will start to slow down. And so that really requires that you bring food up slightly. And it's really carbohydrates that your body's going to respond to. Dietary fat has very little role with most of these processes that we're talking about outside of steroid hormone formation. But if a guy is enhanced, it's really irrelevant at that point.
Now, let me ask you, Kurt, because you are the medical expert. From my knowledge, just understanding what you just said, I would correlate that with it being in the form of carbohydrates, aka glucose. That would have to do something with IGF-1 levels, possibly with bringing that up from a physiological standpoint, or is that not correlation together?
It is. So IGF tends to respond. IGF can respond to several things, but it is basically like an energy sensor. It's a highly conserved thing that mammals developed over time. Basically, we would grow muscle or tissue when there was food that was abundant, and that's really what it's going to respond to. So the common thing that you see now is that guys are correlating it with estrogen solely. So the liver needs estrogen. We touched on this yesterday too. The liver needs estrogen to function correctly. Estrogen is liver protective to some degree. When estrogen is taken orally, it is not. That's the whole other scenario. The natural endogenous estrogen that is produced, or through aromatization from testosterone, whether natural or not, is liver protective as long as it's within a range. Super physiological levels of estrogen is not protective of anything. And it's not necessarily conducive to high IGF-1. It'll raise it in serum, but it's generally bound. And there's a lot of research going into this stuff now because those binding proteins, there's 7 of them in humans. They have a lot of role in cancer too. So the way that what organs they target. But yeah, like you said, glucose amounts. Glucose is anabolic, right? It's not so much the carbohydrates, but it's the hormonal response from glucose, IGF, or all of these things, insulin, that basically help drive muscle growth and keep muscle on you as well. That's why guys will actually skip that and actually just inject things like Increlux. You want it, and with leptin too. Like leptin responds to protein and glucose and fiber. It does not respond to high. So again, I'm not anti-eating fruit. I think fruit is incredibly healthy as part of a balanced diet. But like one of the things that we might remove, depending on the person at the end, is something like fructose, because leptin doesn't respond to it. Leptin doesn't respond to dietary fat. It has. Fat is satiating in the fact that it sits in your stomach, but the brain doesn't recognize it in that way. Not through leptin, at least.
So satiety will be better. Yeah, satiety is going to be better with fats, obviously. Satiety will be better with high fibrous foods and polyphenols from the low sugar berries. But those are the 2 things I'm pulling first. I'm not touching complex carbohydrates or even, simple sugars in the form of maybe a processed food on a refeed day. I need that for fuel and anabolism for the individual, especially in a deep deficit, especially when body fat's low. I understand, from a nutritional standpoint, dietary fats are very important for lipid profile and healthy balanced ratio of that, proper cognition. But at the end of the day, we're trying to get as lean as possible, and we're trying to hold on to as much tissue as we can. So I will always veer to a lower fat, higher moderate carb diet, moderate protein, just enough protein to hold on to the tissue, because we know carbs are protein sparing in a sense. So that's why, I've gotten pushback from people like, man, your diets tend to be on the lower fat side. And I'm like, listen, for an athlete that's looking for a aesthetic physique, and we have a goal and we have a tentative date in mind, we're going to attack it from the most optimal way. Now, I understand there's a lot of people that love higher fat diets. They've had some success with ketogenic diets. I don't see that as much as someone that's dieting on lower fats, higher carbs, moderate protein. So man, I'm right there with you. I pull fruits and fats first before anything else.
Yep. So 100%. Just so people can understand the physiology, it was just what you were saying, but because people are going to give pushback about the fat thing. If we're talking about enhanced athletes, the fat need is very low, right? If you talk about a natural athlete, you could still in a healthy state get by with 20% of your calories, but in dieting for a show as a natural athlete, you still got to pull the fat down. Hormones will suffer at that point, but you have to pull the fat down if you want to get lean. So people understand from a really basic point of view, carbohydrates aren't stored in adipose tissue. Unless you have a metabolic syndrome, diabetes, they are stored, and we've known this for 120 years. They're stored as glycogen. It's also in the liver. They circulate as blood sugar. So when you overeat, so you're not really defying thermodynamics by carb cycling, because you're still excess of energy and you're still storing that excess, but it's not getting stored as fat. Right. So if you refeed someone with white rice, they will store the excess as glycogen. Right. And the way that excess carbohydrates will be stored as fat is they basically have to circulate through the whole system, basically to the liver twice. The liver's still full of glycogen and it cannot take anymore. It will be converted to a triglyceride. And then those triglycerides will circulate as a triglyceride and then get stored as fat. That's the storage form. That's why we pull dietary fat. Dietary fat is already enters the lymphatic system in the storage form already. So it's ready to go. You eat peanut butter, your body's ready to store that.
Yeah, I mean, it's the whole reason why when people fill out for a show, they typically don't fill out with fats, right? Dietary fats. I mean, there's, I believe, a little bit of triglycerides involved in muscular tissue. It's very minute though, so it's not going to tip the scale in one form or another. We're always going to shoot for loading glycogen into the cell of the muscle tissue, right? Because that's going to fill it out, and that's going to bring the water where we need to into the intracellular space. So, I mean, dietary fats, and I'm glad that you differentiated that. Very important. Natural athletes will need a little bit more for sure, but those enhanced guys, come on. The enhanced guys can get away with really digging deep. The problem is, and we've talked about this, especially on those hard push, low carb days, I'll even call them death days sometimes, because it's when you feel like pure death. Guys don't want to dig hard enough. They just don't want to get into that deficit hard enough and really push through those hard days to get to those higher carb days for that super compensation effect that can occur and can happen. But that's very important to use those deficit days, like we've talked about, me and you off camera, to really get to those low body fat levels. And so carb cycling, calorie cycling at the end of the day, man, you got to dig on those days for sure. I'm a huge advocate and believer in that.
So with the super compensation or super saturation day, as you call it, it's funny because you see it. A lot of that actually stemmed from endurance athletes, marathon runners, and things like that. And you see that they still do it wrong, right? They won't eat first. They'll eat normal. They'll train for their race, and then the night before the race, they eat a big bowl of pasta. And the problem is, if you can only store, let's say, an average person stores 400 grams of glycogen, and you don't deplete, you don't do that, you don't dig into that deficit hard first, you're only going to store 400 grams of glycogen. The body's not magically going to create new places to put it. Absolutely. So it's not even going to get used at that point. So like what you and I create is we're creating basically a situation where the body wants to super compensate because it's nervous that there might not be any more food for a while. So it will hold more, right? So if you normally hold, again, I'm talking about average person, bodybuilders hold. An average person, if they hold 400, you get them really depleted for a while and you burn up that glycogen. They might hold 500 or 600 grams, right? Which is the difference from a couple pounds on stage. In fullness,
that,
you're going to look
100%. And that comes down to having an eye for it. You're going to have an eye and have experience anecdotally. Again, you understand the science aspect, the physiological stuff, the nutrition, how the body works, the mechanisms, the mechanics. But if you don't have that eye to be able to look at someone and be like, we can push a little bit more, we can pull back, or we need to hold. And this is great for the listeners because there is no one blanket answer. You could write a book as a coach and regurgitate what you think works, right? So you could go out and say, add 30 grams of carbs on Wednesday to each meal. Thursday, add 40 grams of carbs, 50 grams of carbs on Friday, cut your sodium Friday, introduce a thiazide diuretic, add it back in at night, once the water, it doesn't work that way. No. And you may get a few people that actually show up decent, but the way that the body responds in this process, man, it is and this because you're in the medical field, when you're at such it's a touch and go process, when you're so sensitive to everything. And we'll talk about the potassium shifting and fluid shifting because of that, because you're just so lean, you can literally see things happen so fast. Man, it's all coming down to the coach's eye and what they're seeing. And then if the athlete doesn't have the coach, what they know internally, what to feel for, what to look for, muscle contraction. Exactly. So it's great stuff, man.
I never set up anyone's peak week until we get there. And I always preface that I'd be lying if I told you what it looks like. I don't know what it's going to look like. It's different. Not only between people, it's different between the same person, multiple shows, right? Like I've had to do totally different things depending on my, what's going on in my body. There's so many factors. Metabolism, if anyone is curious, if you Google human metabolism and look at a chart of it, it's years of studying just alone to figure out what that is. No one fully grasps every single step. No one's memorized that.
I agree 100%. Yeah. And I tell this, people say, what's my peak week look like? I said, dude, I have no idea.
I would
just be ready for the ride, man.
Yeah.
Be ready for the ride. I'm going to find out with you, man. We're going to take it day to day and we're going to build the process based off how you look, what your body's doing, how you're managing cortisol, fatigue, which is really important. And this again, from a physiological standpoint, from your background, man, that is one of the biggest things at the end of the prep. The last week and the last couple of days is managing cortisol levels and being able to really drop down for the systemic inflammation that you've gone through the process of prepping for the show. It is the only way to fully be able to recover, reset, and have fresh looking tissue on stage that is doing what it needs to do. You're getting out of the fight or flight, you're getting into the rest and digest state, and your body's able to have proper gut motility and digestion and utilization of carbohydrates and partitioning. So all these things come in together. And I always tell people, man, sleep. It's absolute necessity, which is where I start to kind of titrate down cardio the final week slowly. And I allow people to sleep more. And when you do that and you kind of understand that, people freak out because they're like, dude, I got to push, man. We're almost there. And I'm like, no. The work is done now. Now we rest the body and everything starts flowing in. You'll see with these nutritional manipulations we do, because the body fat's gone, cortisol needs to come down, the body will start to respond so much better to everything. It's just phenomenal how it works, you know, from the vagus nerve with fight or flight response or getting into rest and digest. That the people that overthink, and you know, you could maybe touch on this, but the people that overthink like the day before the show, like they're stressed, like there's chronic stressed people. They look at themselves every 10 minutes. I'm flat. My veins are going away. Or, you know, those people are in a state of fight or flight, and they're
making their veins go away.
They won't use the bathroom.
No,
because they just won't poop because they're in fight or flight. Digestion shut down. They start getting bloated, and not only that, they'll also, and you know, I don't know if this is anecdote just from my experience, what we talked about off camera with antidiuretic hormone, ABP, also the same thing, interchangeable. They stop peeing as much too. You know,
and it starts to retain.
Now, naturally, a human physiological response in fight or flight, from my understanding, actually you will urinate more. But because typically what people are doing at that point is they're doing some form of dehydration and they've used some sort of pharmacological diuretic. So therefore it doesn't correlate the same. So I know on paper it says that, but that's where I say it doesn't always add up on paper.
Yeah. With bodybuilders, you don't necessarily see that. Yeah. And I think you also have some other things going on at the end too, that make the cortisol worse, right? So you're typically, at least in my experience, you're typically pulling injectables during peak week, right? To eliminate some inflammation, any chance of aromatization. There is definitely some systemic inflammation, even from things like trenbolone that you can see. You can see there's like a film under your skin generally, right? You might leave orals in depending on the person, depending on what you're using. But it's trenbolone, one of the main effects is it's blocking cortisol's action at the receptor site. So when you pull that out, especially because that state's out of you in 2 days, if you're not careful with, like you said, the sleep and pulling the cardio and just relaxing, you'll see the stress level build back up. You have to be careful, right? There's only certain things. I mean, halotestin will help with that as well, but like to a degree, it's not as strong as.
Oh no, I totally agree with you. So one thing I've found anecdotally that works really well is a cortisol inhibitor, amoded, going into the final week, is a phenomenal way to really be able to reduce that, especially in somebody that's having those issues. So the only problem with Amodin is it can cause some gastric distress, so people can't have diarrhea as a side effect. So I usually start people on Amodin 3 to 4 weeks out, small amounts. It helps them sleep better and it reduces cortisol slowly, so that when we do pull those compounds, we don't have that kind of reaction, right? So I try to always backload with certain things to prevent things from happening. And that's just years of learning, because I've made that mistake where I've seen that and I didn't understand the pharmacology behind it and the body's response. It was just trial and error, and then taking notes and then kind of figuring out, well, maybe this is what the reason is. So how can we correct this? How can we troubleshoot this? And that is what I think makes a great coach. Is we are going to fail with certain clients and peaks, but we got to learn from them, and we got to take notes, and we got to understand where did we go wrong? Where did the athlete go wrong? Because, you know, sometimes the athlete doesn't always listen 100%. You know, they'll add in, you know, their own thing. Like I've had people that, you know, we go to bed at night, the night before the show, phenomenal, but they were waking up to urinate, that they were starving. So they just started eating, you know, snacks, you know, so we didn't have that overnight drop that I thought we were going to have, that I correlated it from weeks of tallying notes. And I was like, what did you do? Yeah, you know, I had a sleeve of rice cakes with almond butter, and it just
with almond butter.
I'm like, yeah, well, dude, you just kind of ruined it, my man. So
yeah. Well, I've seen it in men and women. That the other one they like to do is they like to add things to the diet, but not tell you, because it's just a little bit, right? It's like a protein bar every day. But it's a protein bar every day. It's an extra 400 calories a day that you're just not accounting for, right? Or or those silly Lenny and Larry's cookies. Like I was prepping a woman once.
Oh Lord,
half of one a day. She was 100 pounds, so it's a big deal for someone like her. She just wasn't getting leaner.
Slippery slope, man. That's a slippery slope for people.
She's like, well, I thought it was a half a cookie.
Yeah,
300 calories.
So yeah, it's that'll destroy you right there, man. Anytime someone is like picking or snacking, worst thing you can do. You think you're not doing much damage, but like you said, over time, that caloric intake just really increases, and it's horrible.
Yeah, because I mean, ideally, you want what you're really looking for. You know, for most guys, if you're losing a pound a week average, right, you're 3,500 calories. So it's 500 calories a day. You add 300 calories back to that. That's an awful lot of cardio you got to make up for that 300 calories.
Absolutely.
I typically do at least, again, on average, I'll do, kind of a mix of cardio and deficit there to make it a little easier on them. You do 250 cardio and you do 250 in the diet. Obviously you might have to pull down more, but that's kind of at least a place that I generally start. That way they're not so shocked.
Absolutely.
Or go by their body type. Paul and I have talked about this before too. Guys like me and probably you as well that tend to be leaner, naturally, you would probably do better perhaps with a more, like if you were competing, you'd probably do better with more stimulants than you would with more cardio. Like there's a point where cardio is going to waste your muscle off your body.
100%.
And for the guy who's naturally heavier, probably does better with more cardio and less stimulants.
Yeah, no, I actually just had a coaching call this morning on this actual subject right here. So more endomorphic, huskier, thicker skin, hard to lose fat. Those guys are going to be pounding cardio for the most part. It's just the way that it is. I mean, and then more ectomorphic, maybe a little bit of mesomorphic mixture, which is what I am, probably what you are, fast metabolizer, but we can also eat tissue really quick. My legs would always go fast if I did too much Sterimil, which is why I really learned that, just getting, this was back 16 years ago before steps were popular. There was no Apple Watches to track. I learned that just going out for a 30-minute walk in the morning just did me a lot better results, so I wasn't getting a crazy inflammatory cortisol spike in response with my body. My legs got saved and I was still getting fat loss every single week, so I think it's really important to understand what that body type needs, like you said. So really, really want to hone in on the specificity of that body type, the metabolism. And one thing that I do, and this could be even a little neurotic, but I really, after many, many years of making a lot of mistakes, I said, listen, I'm just going to tell people to pull blood work every 3 weeks during a prep. I just think it's so vital, man, because if we're seeing something happen in the thyroid, and I always, precursors first, tyrosine, selenium, iodine, all these things for proper thyroid function before going into a T3 or even a T2, which I've seen good success without muscle wasting. T4 sometimes, I've learned over the years, because we've always been taught as bodybuilders that when you're taking growth hormone, you want to add in T4 for the down regulation of the conversion. And my understanding as of late, over the last year or two, is that actually is not what you want to do.
You don't need it.
And you're actually hurting your T3 at the end of the day. So that's, you don't want to go there. I always start with precursors like a selenium, iodine, eating all your micronutrients. Then we divulge into thyroid usage. But I always try to go to, the adrenergic, A2 adrenergic, yohimbine, raucine, alpha yohimbine. I like raucine, alpha yohimbine much better than just your regular yohimbine. It's a lot less side effects, but we're really able to tap into those hard to lose body fat issues, areas like the lower back kidney region, the lower abdominal. So I will always start with that, with some caffeine, and then maybe even a little bit of Broncaid, which you will get at Walgreens. So we got the ECY stack in. Aspirin, we know why, the mechanism behind doing that, but I've had issues over the years of people doing that every day. Yeah. So I'm a little timid to do that every day, and I'd rather stick to the ECY stack or utilize, just an over-the-counter fat burner before we get into the clenbuterol or the albuterol. The problem with clenbuterol that I know is the half-life is so long that people have a lot of issues with sleeping on it. Yep. And we know that with albuterol, the half-life, I believe, is around 2 hours, 3 hours, maybe 2 to 4 hours, and it's in and out of the system. It gives
with
you
the ephedrine.
What's that?
With the ephedrine.
No, the albuterol.
Oh, albuterol. Sorry, I thought you said
Yeah. No, I was bouncing around, man. Maybe I go too fast. Yeah.
No. I'm just making sure it wasn't clenbuterol you're saying, because that's 36.
Yeah. So clen obviously is very potent. It works. I've used it many times. I still use it on many clients this day. Dosages will be dependent and varied. And from my understanding, people will say you got to cycle it. The beta-2 receptors get downregulated. You bring in ketotifen, old school train of thought, and you're still losing fat. And one thing that I say to people is, if you don't feel it, that's great, because you're not getting the side effects from it, but you're still losing body fat. You're still getting the response that you need to lose fat paired with cardio nutrition. You can correct me if I'm wrong on that.
I was just going to back up for a second and touch on a couple of things we talked about, just because I feel like people will post questions below. So with dietary fat, I'm just going to go back for a second. So
Oh, perfect.
Really the only two fats that we all need is basically ALA and LA, which you can technically synthesize EPA and DHA, which is in fish oil. So that's why they're not considered essential. That's actually what your body's looking for. And the conversion rate is like 3% in humans, especially men. I think it's 5% in women. You want to take fish oil. Like when you're going to bring your fat, you have to be taking fish oil every day regardless. And you want 3 or 4 grams of it. When you're especially when you're dieting and you pull the fat down, you need that. All the other fatty acids on the human body, we synthesize on our own. So like olive oil's magic properties aren't in the fat. It's in the properties from the olive themselves. It's called oleic acid is the fat that's in olive oil. We make oleic acid from stearic acid. And look at most Americans, they have hundreds of thousands of calories of fat on their butt. So we don't need to.
Perfect, Kurt. That's a great point. Fish oils I never take out. I always keep them high, and it's always a high quality, highest EPA DHA ratio. I like Wiley's Finest Fish Oil or Nordic Naturals. It doesn't go rancid, and great point. So we always keep that in for sure, because like you said, that's really all you need at the end of the day. You know,
thyroid, yeah, you're correct. So T4, the way I would describe T4 is like the idle in your car. You don't need to touch it. It's kind of what you're born with. It's just showing your basic idle, and you don't need to manipulate it. Like it's a good marker to see, but it's a precursor and it's inactive, right? You don't need to supplement. And the whole thing with growth hormone, you're not doing anything. You don't need to be adding T4, in to make growth hormone more effective.
It's not the gold standard for thyroid production.
It was something that was done long time ago. Clenbuterol versus, so some new science with clenbuterol. I have a whole video that I did with Dean on clenbuterol, but I'll touch on it fast. So basically, clenbuterol's ephedrine basically is just working through beta 2, which is basically neat. It's basically just making you move more and appetite suppression, and that's why those receptors do downregulate. So the key different thing was basically for that beta 3 receptors, which is really what you want, which is what clenbuterol hits. That's most fat loss. Those receptors actually don't downregulate at all. Only in obese people. We don't know why. If they could figure that out, there probably would be no obesity. So technically, there's not a medical recommendation, but clen technically can stay on longer term. There's no shutdown of those receptors.
That was my understanding.
Not feeling it is totally fine. You shouldn't feel it because beta 3 doesn't have a feeling. Beta 2 has a feeling. So when you first take clen and you can't sleep, that's not beta 3. That's not fat loss. That's beta 2. That's your heart and things getting hit.
That was my understanding over the last 2 years, where my thought pattern changed with clenbuterol and actually trying to cycle it or not run long enough. And everybody would say, well, it's because you don't feel it anymore. I'm like, listen, that is insane.
You don't feel testosterone after a while. What does that mean? You need to cycle?
Yeah, exactly. So you're still getting the effective wanted outcome, which is fat loss.
Yep, that's
like you said,
the bronchate ephedrine. To me, the benefit there is basically appetite suppression.
100%.
You look at like probably 90% of the fat loss that occurs from ephedrine is basically because you're not hungry. And I think it's a great technique versus using something like a GLP.
Yes.
You put someone who really struggles, because especially if someone's lost a ton of weight before prep, their appetite's totally disordered.
Yeah.
It's like they're really going to struggle with the hunger versus like guys like you and I can suffer all day. I don't really care. Like I kind of, in a weird way, I kind of enjoy it. Whereas a lot of people just really have trouble with appetite. Ephedrine's a great thing to use for them because it kind of blunts that to some degree.
Yeah, and I think that too, there may be some correlation with dopamine release and their correlation to food, right? So they utilize food for that dopamine release, which is why I love tyrosine. And I like to also attack the cholinergic system with, alpha GPC and then uridine monophosphate. So I like nootropics for that reason too. But you pair that with ECA, just like you said, man, it's going to control the appetite, which adherency to satiety signals is the number one thing for being successful at a diet. You have to control it. It's just the way that it is, and if you're hungry, sparkling water, coffee, gum, if you even want to go down the route of, if you want to go down the route of nicotine, obviously that's a really good appetite suppressant as well, but it is a vasoconstrictor at the same time. So you can have issues with that, but really just, man, it's a phenomenal tool, ECA for appetite suppressant, but clenbuterol, let's just make sure people understand beta 3 receptor is not getting downregulated. You're getting the fat loss.
And you can mix, again, not medical advice, and I'm not advising it, but you can technically use ephedrine and clenbuterol at the same time because they're two different classes of compounds. ephedrine is more related to like a methamphetamine,
Yeah.
and clenbuterol is not. So that they can technically be paired. I'm not recommending that people do that, but they can be used together and they work through two totally different mechanisms.
Absolutely.
The aspirin, because you mentioned it before, just so people know, the aspirin was basically in the ECA stack, the original one, because it extended the half-life, fat loss if you need something. And then I think guys over time then started adding yohimbine in, like you said. So it became the ECY stack.
Yep.
I don't personally love yohimbine. Makes me feel weird. Makes my blood pressure do strange things.
Absolutely.
I think you can definitely use it for the trouble areas. Like
you're
saying. I also find a good, it's basically blocking the uptake of fat versus burning fat per se. What I almost find it more useful when someone's like on a high day, same way that someone might use insulin, right? Because if you really have no fat going in, like in a low day, when you're in a big deficit, you really have no fat getting stored, maybe a tiny bit like after each meal, but it almost seems pointless to me if you're using it just to block fat storage in a deficit.
Yeah, and especially if you're having a lot of anxiety from it. So they note that, you know, if you suffer from bipolar disorder or any type of neurological biochemistry that's off, do not take yohimbine, because we do know that it's basically increasing adrenaline, putting you into a fight or flight state, which is why people just feel so strange on it, or they get nauseated. So if you're taking, obviously, we know that Raucine or yohimbine on an empty stomach, because it works best with low glucose levels to do exactly what you just said. But, you know, the payoff may not be worth it per se, which again is why I'm a big fan of like Super Shredder from Amino Asylum. It's an albuterol mix with B12 in there, inositol choline. So it's an injectable amino acid that you literally use a little bit right before cardio, and you literally feel it immediately. But 2 hours later, it's out of your system and you can sleep at night. So it's a great alternative if clenbuterol is not the route for you, because it does disrupt a lot of people with sleep.
Another tip why you mentioned sleep and chemicals that disrupt sleep. So something that Dr. Dean had taught me during show prep, if you're using tren, which most guys probably are to some degree, if it's disrupting your sleep, you take more magnesium. A lot of times adding more magnesium glycinate or biglycinate will generally get rid of at least some of that trensomnia or whatever is occurring. A lot of times that's basically, you know, that's what's occurring. So it generally fixes that without adding other drugs in there.
No, dude, and that's phenomenal. It's just like with equipoise, adding in GABA will help with anxiety if you have issues with that neurologically. So, dude, there's always a cascading effect, and I always believe that you can bring in certain minerals and electrolytes and precursors to mitigate it, instead of bringing in like a telmisartan or you know a phenibut. A lot of guys like to use phenibut, which is highly addictive. You know, and of course, melatonin, I'm not a huge fan of unless you respond well to it. Instant release is okay, but I'm the kind of guy that I feel super groggy in the morning when I use melatonin. So that's why I'm a huge fan of Amodin, because it really reduces the cortisol level and it really gets you into a deep REM sleep. But magnesium is the number one thing, what you just mentioned. It is absolutely phenomenal, along with ashwagandha.
Ashwagandha as well. I was going to say that's a good one for cortisol as well too. People try that. I would say that with magnesium, because people ask about dosing, I'm just anticipating the questions that we're going to get. There is the RDA is very off. It's way too low. But there's no known, like there's no easy way to know what, like I couldn't just guess what you need to take. You generally titrate up until you have soft stools, and then you basically.
I had to triple mine. Mine.
When your stomach gets weird, that's when it's too much, and you basically just pull back a little bit, and that's your sweet spot. Mine is, I don't remember, 600 or 800 milligrams or something. I don't know how many pills it is.
I was 800. I went to 800, and I was able to really get the benefits from D.
Absolutely. Like a gram was a little too much for me, but some people
a gram would be pushing it. But it's kind of just like vitamin D3, K2. I mean, you know, vitamin D3 is going to be depending on the individual's blood work, I always say. So, you know, I've had to go up to 15,000 IUs and I get a phenomenal response with no vitamin D3 toxicity. And I feel so much better. My immune system's running better. Cognitively, I'm better. I have more energy. So that's a great thing to touch on, Kurt, is always dose dependent on the individual. So
and do labs.
Labs. Absolutely, man.
With magnesium, another cool marker is ALP, which is typically a liver enzyme marker. But if you look, that also shows magnesium status. With vitamin D too, magnesium basically, if you don't have enough magnesium, which most Americans are deficient in magnesium, renders vitamin D useless. So you can take all the D in the world, it won't do anything if you're magnesium deficient. And when you said iodine before for thyroid, that's another one. I think 85% or 86% of Americans are deficient in iodine because no one eats fish. So definitely worth, definitely worth looking at if your metabolism is a little slow before you jump on things like T3.
Yeah. I like Icelandic kelp iodine. It's 41 milligrams. You can get on Amazon. It's a phenomenal, very high quality iodine source. You just have to be a little careful with selenium and iodine because if you go too high, you can cause issues with that. So I always start very low. So I would tell even a person to pour out the capsule a little bit, start super low and then build from there and see how you tolerate it, So yeah, this is great stuff, brother. What do you want to touch on next, man? What do you think other people
we're in the middle of prep, right? So I mean, I could touch on what I would do cycle wise, like rough. Again, I'm not giving I don't give outside of really random circumstances. I try not to discuss doses. I think it's irresponsible, and I think people mimic it. And I also think that you get pushed back one way or another. Either people believe that they think it's too low, or they think it's too high, or they think you're full of shit. I would typically start if it's a newer person. It's generally very mild. It's testing an anabolic, and then you might switch up to some short esters and maybe an oral or something before. For more advanced guys, to me, it's generally, it's going to be, a test in equipoise, possibly Tren E. I know guys don't seem to understand that. In my experience, is what most of the big pros are still using in the off season. They all don't talk about that anymore. They all pretend they're on the Tren and Primo, test and Primo. That seems to be the game everyone's playing.
Yeah.
To me, it's usually test, EQ, Tren, possibly Anadrol. I think back in the day with D-bol, you're going to get some synergistic effect between either D-bol and Anadrol and the Trenbolone. Anadrol seems to be slightly, it's not safer, but a less side effect prone oral because you're not getting the water or the estrogen activity. And
you're
then
also
generally,
suppressant as a side effect from Anadrol too.
Exactly. Oh, at a certain period. I think in the beginning it makes you hungry, and then all of a sudden it kills your appetite.
Yeah. Middle of the prep, you're getting that appetite suppression typically. Yeah.
And then typically, at 8-10 weeks, probably switch it up. Test prop, mass prop, Tren acetate, Winstrol, Anavar, and then I would typically, you and I've talked about this off camera. I typically would titrate the Winstrol up. I might not even use Anavar. Anavar to me is relatively useless. If your testosterone's over 500 milligrams, Anavar seems like a silly thing to add to me. It's not really adding much at that point. I think it's a fantastic compound for things like recovery, post-surgery. Like if you're on some sort of TRT plus, I think it has a function. I think, if you're using grams of gear, to me, it's relatively useless at that point.
Yeah.
I'd save your kidneys and your liver. And then I would titrate the Winstrol up. I'd pull the injectables at the end, possibly run, possibly halo testing, possibly T3, possibly fat burners if they weren't added earlier. Depends when you add those things. I think, again, that's such an individual process.
Yeah.
I like to keep my guys similar to you. I like to keep my guys leaner all year round. I'm not a fan of people getting big and fluffy. They don't need to. Some guys have to put on the weight.
Yeah.
You can generally keep them in better shape.
Yeah. It makes prep a lot easier.
Yeah.
It just does.
You grow, you're going to get more muscular if you're lean.
You're going to grow into the show. You have the ability for less fatigue by doing less cardio. You can train more. You can actually have energy output to pose, which a lot of guys get very lazy in practicing the presentation and posing because they're so chronically fatigued from the fact that they got so heavy in the off season and then they're having to kill themselves. So I'm always about staying leaner. You're going to get better insulin sensitivity response. You can eat more into the show. You're going to preserve and if not grow. And I always see people actually putting on some sort of muscle tissue into the show. It's a phenomenal way to actually do it. And I think there was something now, again, he's a hyper responder, but Kevin Levrone would stop training for 6 months and he would downsize, but he was lean for the most part, and he would,
he never got he just looked like a regular athletic middle-aged guy, but he obviously, and then he would turn into Mr. Olympia.
Super hyper responder, totally get that, totally understandable. But at the same time, you're always going to have a better response to any androgenic and anabolic, in my opinion, the leaner you are. Your body can process it with less side effects. When you're starting at a heavier standpoint, your lipids are typically already skewed. Your liver enzymes can already be elevated to an extent, not always, but you're going to usually run into more issues. And again, like you said, Kurt, guys do need to grow. I get it. But if you're at a certain size, at a certain level, there's no point to exacerbate it 40, 50, 60 pounds above stage weight.
We've all done it.
We've all done it, and you're just running your body into the ground. Your blood pressure is higher. You're having all these issues with sleep apnea and recovery, and then you're doing hours of cardio, and it's just it creates a more stressful environment. I believe contest prep is already stressful enough on the body. You want to mitigate stress as much as possible. So doing it smart and methodically, I call it prep for prep. So you're prepping year round for your contest prep. You're setting yourself up to have the best case scenario to win in your contest prep.
Yep.
And that is by staying in a leaner state. I 100% agree with you.
Yeah,
absolutely.
And just the other funny thing you see is on lab work, during prep, when you introduce some of these compounds, most people would assume that your blood work is going to become atrocious, right? You have orals, you have things like trenbolone, which, contrary to what again goes on the internet, if used correctly in the right situation at the right dose for the person, what they can handle, it's not as notoriously horrible for your lab work as people assume. It's not causing kidney failure. It's not doing all these things. There are case studies, of course, with any drug. Aspirin cause death too. I think you notice, at least I've seen, when guys get leaner, even when they add the more so-called toxic things, their blood work actually improves because they're leaner, their body's working better. So that's another reason to stay leaner in the off season too, because why are you letting your cholesterol and these things, triglycerides, get way out of whack? Your fasting glucose go high. These are things that should be always managed. If you want to do this, if you, like we talked about in our previous video, if you just want to be optimal in general when you're done competing, you want to stay healthy as long as possible.
Longevity is key, man. Longevity is key. And again, the younger guys, 20s, early mid 20s, I understand you're trying to grow, especially if you want to go pro, you're trying to be a super heavyweight, there's a time and a place, but the majority of people are not in that scenario. So we're talking to kind of the general population in terms of how to approach it from a smart, methodical. As far as PED usage, I'm pretty much right on point. I like propionate's phenomenal. I've had a lot of success with testosterone acetate, which is very hard for most people to get. And test no ester for, especially before training for performance. The onset time is so quick, 45 minutes to an hour before training. You're just like the Anavar. If you take it sublingually pre-workout, you're going to get an acute strength gain, right? So keeping someone's performance up in the gym. But at the end of the day, we know that the fast-acting ester of testosterone, or fast-acting ester of the testosterone, really at propionate's levels, I think that does a fine job. What I see some guys have an issue with is the carrier oils, the benzylbenzenate, benzyl alcohol, depending on what it comes in, causing too much post-injection pain. So then you have to figure out if someone's actually allergic to that, because there are a lot of individuals I've come across that are allergic to those faster esters. Typically, it's not a problem. And the reason that I agree with you 100% on the Anavar being dropped and Winstrol being the main DHT derivative oral that we're going into the show with is because it absolutely works exactly the way that you want it to every single time. And yes, you're going to get some cartilage deterioration naturally from it. That happens. Your joints are drying out. I get it. It's only 2 weeks. You're not trying to get PRs in the gym. We're trying to get the hardest, most separated physique, and you are not completely destroying ALT, AST. Your liver's processing it, and I would much rather do that on a higher dosage than run tren for 20 weeks at a higher dosage. I would much rather pull injectables early and then bump the orals up. That's just me.
And Winstrol is the look that you're going for. That's what my guys misunderstand this. They think tren is causing that look. The look you want is the Winstrol. It's that dry, grainy, striated look is from Winstrol.
That's what we want.
Tren to me is used to hold tissue when you're dieting. If you're already lean, you don't need to use that much tren. And that's when I made that video with Wesley. The people didn't believe that he pulled the tren early. He was already ripped. He didn't need tren. It was doing him no good. Why would you just leave it in there to leave it in there?
I have pulled tren out for a top pro that we won 2 pro shows with 5 weeks out. And he looked better. And I believe it has a correlation with prolactin, progesterone with some guys just can't handle it. And I'd rather not put somebody on a cabergoline or a pramipexole. So I like to stay away from those if at all possible.
Those are not good drugs.
Yeah, exactly. So because neurologically, there's a lot of issues that happen, and I'm sure you can dive more into that.
Heart issues, and also people have to understand that like some of those things, it's not the tren was designed to cause those things, but some of the functions of trenbolone as a molecule through those mechanisms are why it works so well, right? So it's trying to purposely so prolactin in men is only increased when estrogen is up. or T3 is down. Those are the only two, unless you have an adenema on your pituitary, which requires surgery. Those are the only two situations. So generally it's one of the other two things. Trenbolone drives the T3 down slightly because it's actually trying to optimize your metabolism. In cows, they have a fast metabolism. They're not going to grow muscle on the same amount of food, right? That's nutrient partitioning. For a guy like me, that's why I have to eat so much. My thyroid runs fast, right? So if you slow it down a little bit, I might be able to apply more. If there's anabolism there, something causing anabolism, I might be able to apply more food to tissue versus just running my thyroid through the roof. By playing with those numbers, playing with those things, you're almost outdoing what Trent is supposed to be doing.
Yeah, absolutely.
It's almost a brilliant thing by mistake.
So I'd rather pull it early than go to the
other things.
And guys have
a prolactin issue.
I've seen guys actually look a lot better off of it. We would implement it, we'd put it in, and we'd run it for 3 weeks. Side effects are too harsh, but the look is just not improving. It's not. There's too much happening within their system that I'm like, pull it out. We're going to replace it with this. And then boom, within a week, dude, not only do they feel much better, but they look 10 times better.
You feel, we kind of touched on this yesterday too. When you feel better, when your system's running optimally, you look better. Like your skin is an organ. Everything just shows how you're running inside. If you are inflamed and things, you're just, something's wrong.
This is great stuff, man. I mean, we're already an hour in. Let's touch on one more thing. We're gonna do multiple parts, guys. We're gonna have to break this up because
we should probably do peak week as a separate when we touch on that.
We'll do peak week as a separate. We can touch on
we can do abductone as a separate video if you want.
Yeah.
With the peak week.
Yeah, for sure. So we can touch on real quick and we can leave you guys with this. So everyone gets into the final week of loading, not loading. When do you load? How long does it take for glycogen to load? That's all individualistic. I peak people different. I may do a slow titration starting on Sunday for a Saturday show where I'm literally reverse dieting the person every day slowly, with obviously carbohydrates being the main source of macronutrient. I'll always decrease protein going in. Carbs are protein sparing. Plus, we also want to bring in the waste as much as possible. So just food volume in general, I want to bring down and keep gastric emptying as fast as possible, especially the last day into show day. Then there's midweek, there's front load, there's back load. There's all sorts of ways, which we will get into. But what I would love to leave people with is what we were talking about before we got on camera, and that's how we shift fluids, from the subcutaneous to the intracellular, where we want the fluid to be in the muscle. There's a huge misconception on mineral and electrolyte balance and what actually does what it needs to do mechanically, right? So I made a post about potassium chloride and potassium as a whole the other week, and people were trying to figure out, and some people understood, like, you do a combination of that with salt, you're getting a muscle contraction, you're getting a great pump, something you could take backstage, right? So they almost answered it a little bit. So if potassium is causing this muscular contraction, clearly there's something happening that goes against the grain of what we've all been told for decades, that sodium is the main driver, right, into the muscle. Let's touch on that, Kurt. You tell me from your standpoint.
Yeah, and I'll back up a second because where it's relevant in modern bodybuilding and social media. So I think there's a multitude of things that are going on here. So people just generally misunderstand the sodium potassium pump, which again, if you have not, either had your experience or you've even gone to school for these things, how would you understand these things? It's not taught in regular college classes. It's not taught in high school for sure. I think it goes hand in hand with what the other things that are going on. They're running estrogen high. The water retention then is subsequently high. Then they're told that they need to add a ton of salt to their diet. And then their blood pressure goes up, right? Because now they're holding water. So what they do then is, because now everyone's terrified of using an AI, they immediately self-medicate themselves with a potassium-sparing blood pressure medicine like telmisartan. And so not only are they playing cardiologist, which they shouldn't be doing, they're actually managing a problem the wrong way. Right. And this, again, it comes from people with no medical background that really shouldn't be prescribing these things. If you actually have to be on a beta blocker, heart medicine, you need to see a cardiologist. You should not be managing this stuff on your own. Just because you self-prescribe steroids doesn't mean you should be taking care of your heart. Outside, on your own, in my opinion. I think so. What's occurring? So I think probably because salt was cheap and it was an easy way and it made your veins come out. it's somehow caught on in the fitness industry that if you basically drink salt water, you'll somehow transport carbohydrates into your muscles. And the problem is it's lacking the most basic science. It's not what's actually pulling it in. It might take it too, but the potassium actually has to swap and pull it in. So, and it basically spits the sodium back out. And people realize this, they're just not thinking logically. Yeah. When you go to, like, if you go to a Chinese restaurant and eat something that has a ton of salt in it, the next day you woke up and you're bloated, right? You look like a pig. Like your ankles are swollen. That's why you don't want to necessarily out salt. You need salt to live. You need potassium to live. Yeah. And it's not to say there aren't times that you and I might add salt to something, depending on the look. We can touch on that when we do the peaking thing. Because generally 3-4 days out, you can generally look at someone and get a sense of where the minerals are by the look. Right? Like that's what I do. Like I can tell usually in photos, if I'm on the phone, Zoom, whatever, you can tell where they are. But so it's actually the opposite. So like potassium is actually what's going to pull it inside the muscle. Sodium's going to spit it back out.
Yep, absolutely. So, and this will get a lot of pushback, and even people in the medical field would push back on this. But you touched on something that happens in the ER, you know.
So doctors have argued. They'll say, well, what about lactate ringers? You know, someone comes to the ER, you know, and there's electrolyte problem. We give a lactate ringer, and you got salt. Well, that's to manage blood pressure. That's a whole. It's like comparing rat studies to human studies. You're talking about someone in the ER that we're worried about coding versus a bodybuilder who you're trying to peak. They're not necessarily the same situation. Totally different, right? You're talking about saving a life versus creating a look.
Yeah, it's not absolutely.
So salt. And then if you're on telmisartan as well, then all of a sudden you have high potassium automatically. So then you have to be careful. So it makes our job more difficult too, because then we're not really sure what to do with the minerals if they're on drugs.
Yeah, we want to mitigate and manage. Yeah, we don't want to put someone into a hyperkalemic state, obviously, but we do want to make it and preface that potassium is going to be a main driver into getting fluid intracellularly. And then we utilize sodium as the acute vasodilator because it will give you an acute blood pressure increase. That is what will give you a good contraction backstage or give you vascularity. But that's not going to fill the muscle out per se. So that is yes, exactly. So and just like Kurt said, go eat Chinese food that is packed full of sodium and see how you look the next day. You will not look better. So there's a lot of things that people try to do the night before the show. I've even heard of, you know, one crew that's pretty well known in the desert. We'll leave it at that. That loves to give people soy sauce packets the night before. So, you know, it's very interesting. Yeah, it's very, very interesting stuff because they never really show up in shape because they don't understand the scientific physiological response of the potassium, sodium that's needed, how you shift fluids around. Then when you're utilizing and, you know, deploying into, you know, the aldosterone, bringing aldosterone levels down to a specific state. Sorry, I lost my train of thought right there. Bringing aldosterone down, your, you know, cortisol, blood pressure. Obviously, we're talking about aldactone. We're talking about thiazide diuretics, which is made for hypertension. So these are blood pressure medications that will also are used for edema acutely, and these are potassium sparing diuretics, right? So the consensus is, well, if you're using that in keeping other things in that are keeping your internal potassium levels high, you will go hyperkalemic. That is very true. If you're taking oral potassium, 99 milligram tablets all day, eating bananas and dates and potatoes, and you're utilizing aldactone all week on top of that thiazide, you're going to have issues. No doubt about it. So we're not prescribing. We're not telling people specifics. We are just simply saying that you need to get out of the train of thought that sodium is the main driver and potassium is really what the main driver is.
And you and I probably do something similar as well. At least definitely I don't use a ton of potatoes at the end of prep anyway. They're filling and they make the stomach stick out. I would remove all the potassium containing foods like bananas and those things. When I want to keep it as clean with so I can manipulate the minerals if I need to, not have the food throwing things off.
Absolutely. The only time I will throw in a potassium-rich food would be show day. If the person can't go to the bathroom, dates in a very small amount seem to help with getting a bowel movement in. But I would first go to caffeine and possibly even nicotine. Nicotine has been shown to be able to, it relaxes the sphincter. So you're able to get that and go to the bathroom. So but that's it. I mean, there's guys, and we'll leave with this story. A competitor at the Olympia in 2004 who was working with Milos, but he wasn't listening to Milos. I forgot his name. He was, I believe he's Middle Eastern, Iranian. Could be wrong. Please forgive me if I am. I'll get his name and I'll post about it. But he was carving up on bananas and dates, and he was taking aldactone for 5 days, 100 milligrams. And after the Olympia, he fell down in his room. Paramedics came in. What would be the first thing that they would give him? They would give him. They give him an IV of potassium, right?
Oh, potassium. Sorry, yeah, and they call it was Momo, Momo benzenia.
No. So he was earlier in the 90s. You're right. And I think the same thing did happen to him. This was another guy, but Milos was fortunately there, and he kind of let them know what happened because his heart would have stopped. So these are dangerous potassium levels, and I'm glad you touched on the telmisartan because we know that that keeps potassium high in the body. So there's something else going on, like you said, and that is not something I would run. Even if I was running it, I would never run that into a show and then use potassium sparing diuretics. They're going to interact with each other in a dangerous way. You guys are playing with the body in a sense that is very difficult to figure out. And like Kurt said, go to a cardiologist and see what's going on, really, because there's always something going on.
And realistically, you're going to have to use an AI during prep. Unless you're fully pulling test out, you got to use an AI anyway. So
I have no issues with AIs. I have no issues with AIs. I'm all about them. In fact, I'm a big proponent on AI loading at the very end because I have no issue with plummeting estrogen the last couple days.
Yeah,
if it doesn't over flatten the physique, you are only going to get drier. That is exactly what's going to happen. Do not be afraid of using it. It's much better than taking the risk of running high estrogen and then trying to play with other things at the end, thinking that I'm just holding water. So I'm going to use all these diuretics, and you didn't do your homework with the AI. You didn't mitigate the high estrogen.
You know, and if you look it up, if you look up medical studies, the risks in men associated with high estrogen are far greater than the risks of an AI in a man. So if they're not directly, you can search PubMed if you don't believe me. Find how many cardiovascular events are associated directly with an AI in men. You're probably not going to find a single study. It's estrogen itself, when run high, can be a carcinogen. There's all sorts of issues with running estrogen high. So
absolutely,
very silly. I think what AJ and I are trying to do is just put some common sense back into bodybuilding.
There's a smart way to do it. There's a healthy way to do it. You know, bodybuilding is a risk, like we said yesterday. It's an extreme sport. But even with being in a risky sport, there is a better way to go about it. And I can tell you firsthand, from my first years of coaching, I made a lot of mistakes, a lot of error, and I learned from that. So I think it's important that you understand everything that you're putting in your body and the way the body responds. From a pharmacological standpoint, physiological standpoint, pulling labs. I love for people to check their blood pressure on a daily basis, especially at the tail end of the prep. Glucometers are great. Hemoglobin A1C is going to be your 3-month reading of glucose. All these things add up, man. Like, it's important to see what's going on instead of throwing everything at the wall and being like, well, I hope it sticks. And, you know, I'm just going to sodium load because I heard that sodium loading pulls in more glycogen into the muscle. And on top of sodium loading, I'm going to use these potassium sparing diuretics that will pull sodium from subcutaneous later, but it's also going to pull it from your muscle too. It doesn't discriminate. It doesn't know where to pull it from. It's going to pull it from all over. And then you wind up on stage. You didn't exactly flat, wet. You didn't shuttle the fluids the way that they should have. Electrolyte imbalances. You're cramping up. You don't know what to do. People are telling you to eat potato chips, go have a burger after There's just so much crazy stuff that it's a lot of bro science, and it can really get you in a lot of trouble.
Yeah, it's, you know, and the thing is, all the good coaches are doing the same stuff, right? Like AJ and I didn't pre-plan these these are just, we've all arrived at the same place. So it's, if coaches aren't following these things, I would be willing to say they don't know what they're doing.
I mean, full transparency, guys, and we'll end it at this. I came to Kurt right before we started this, and I said, listen, I'm going to run you through my thinking behind this from a physiological standpoint. From your medical background, you tell me if I'm right or I'm wrong. And I thought he was going to push back a little bit, and he said, no, that's actually how the body works. So I was like, wow, well, that's great validation, and that must be why, anecdotally, I've seen it work every single time I've utilized these protocols on people.
Yeah.
But let's finish it too. What did we say in the beginning? You got to get the fat off. That's the number one.
So you have to be fat free. That's the whole premise, right?
Yeah.
Cool, man. Well, we will continue with part 3. So we could do we'll do part 3 on yours, part 3 and 4.
Yeah, we're going to tap whatever people have. You guys have questions, leave them in the comment section. We'll keep coming at you with content, guys. This is something we can do on a regular basis. We're going to let you know whatever we believe, anecdotally, what we've seen from Kurt's background, from my background. But we want to know what you guys want to know. So ask the questions in the comment section, and we will continue to bring this content. You guys, we hope you guys are enjoying it. Thank you again, Kurt, for having me on. I appreciate it.
Thanks for coming, man. Always appreciate it. Take care, guys.